I'm Kevin and Cal, and I'd like to introduce Robin Erickson from Bersin.
Thank you, Kevin, and I'm excited to be here today. Employee engagement and retention are topics that I'm passionate about, and so I'm pleased to be sharing with you the results of a case study that we've written about Guide 1 and how they have used pulse surveys to improve and measure employee engagement. In terms of an introduction, I work at Bersin here, at Bersin by Deloitte. I lead the talent acquisition, engagement, and retention research practices. I've been with Bersin for about 3 years, and prior to joining Bersin, I was part of Deloitte's human capital practice, where I focused on talent strategy projects. Doug, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, Robin, thanks. Hi, everybody. This is Doug Kretzinger, and I've been using TINYpulse for well over a year, and I'm here to share our experience with that. Have had a great experience. My position in the organization, I started in 2012 as the head of strategy, and then I moved into the CIO role and head of business transformation in 2013. Really looking forward to sharing some of our lessons with you, and hopefully it'll help.
Thank you, Doug. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to cover 4 things. We're going to quickly look at Guide 1 insurance and the challenges it faced. Then we're going to look at why does engagement matter and how organizations can design engagement strategies. Then we're going to have Doug walk us through how Guide 1 chose and implemented the TINYpulse solution to help improve communications. And then, as Kevin had alluded to, at the end we'll have the results and the next steps that Guide 1 is taking. Every year, Deloitte Consulting conducts a global survey of, last year, in 2015, there was over 3,300 participants. I believe we actually just announced today's report, which was published today, and they had over 6,000 respondents. So, but in last year's Global Human Capital Trends, you can see there that retention and engagement was the #1 issue, and it was rated as urgent or important by the over 3,300 respondents from over 100 countries. What was happening at Guide 1 back when you started in terms of surveying the workplace about engagement?
So, Robin, we did an engagement survey every 2 years, and then we did a pulse survey once a year. So that was the frequency. Annually, we would have a subset of the total engagement survey, and then we did a full engagement survey every 2 years.
Tell us about Guide 1 and what kind of a company it is, and what sort of, just the basics on Guide 1.
Sure, Robin. So I'm not going to read from the slide. You all can see our history there. I will tell you that we started as a personal lines carrier and have grown to be more dominant in the commercial lines P&C business over the years, and by that I mean we're currently at about 500 million commercial lines, 100 million personal lines. So that's really the split of our premium across those 2 business areas. Our vision is to be the leader in faithfully serving the people, so that's the personal lines part of this, and the organization, that's the commercial lines part of this, in the ministry, nonprofit, education, and care communities. So as it says up there, churches, senior living centers, schools and colleges, those are our commercial clients, and then we have the people that are associated with those nonprofits and markets that we serve on the commercial side. So that's our business model.
Terrific, and I hope you guys saw our little animation on the last slide when the poor goldfish's bag had the holes fixed, so it was no longer leaking. So thank you, Doug, for sharing that background on Guide 1. Tell us about your position and how your team fits into Guide 1's work.
So again, I moved into the role of head of business transformation and CIO in 2013, and you'll see the stats up there about staff, about 100 people, but also have over 200 contractors. So 300 people that we manage as a group. To give you some financial dimensions, we run about 400 million annually in projects and about 20 million annually in our IT budget. So about 60 million of change going on in the organization, lots of projects competing for my staff's attention and these contractors' attention. So my title, combines both CIO along with business transformation, and we have a large group of staff working on that business transformation. And our IT strategy is directly linked to that business strategy. So when I came in, I realized we had some significant challenges when I started talking to folks. So, you know, Robin, you can, I think you've heard my story, so I can talk.
Yeah, so tell us about the challenges.
Yeah, we had, we're replacing our legacy systems, so we have our core systems of policy and claims and billing, and many of my team had worked on these systems for 10, 20, 30 years in some cases. So big change, you know, in the whole environment with a system swap out. Second, we had major transformation programs going on, large programs, a lot of stress, and additional work on the team that they had never seen before. So the level of change, the meter just pegged out from literally, you know, keep the lights on kind of normal day-to-day operations to maxing out the change curve almost overnight. And the third thing is I heard a lot that the prior CIO and management team wasn't really listening to the employees. And so they were gravely concerned that, you know, they didn't have a voice, they weren't empowered, they weren't engaged. So those are the major concerns I heard, Robin.
Okay, and so Kevin, if you'll go to the next slide, what did you do about all of this? Well,
I wanted to get to know my staff personally, so I started by interviewing literally all 100 people, and some of my peers and colleagues felt I was crazy to do that, but I really wanted to, so I set up half-hour interviews for every one of my staff so I could get to know them, wanted to hear their concerns, I wanted to hear their proposed solutions, I wanted to give them a voice because I heard they didn't have a voice. And the thing I heard, you see the questions I asked, the thing I heard that really was compelling was I've worked here 10 years, Doug, and this is the first time I've talked to the CIO one-on-one. Well, that struck me, that they didn't have you know, a communication channel with their CIO or their management team. So I was convicted at that point I needed to change that.
Okay, and what was the response to the employees when they met with you? Were they pleased to have the opportunity?
Without a doubt. Everybody said, wow, this is great that you're taking the time to get to know us. Again, I haven't had this opportunity before, so they came prepared. You know, I sent out these questions ahead of time. I want to know a little bit more about you personally. What challenges are you facing, and what should we do about those challenges? And they came, many of them, not with the problems, but with the solutions too, Doug. I really think we need to try this, you know, a different approach. And so I got a lot of ideas, and I actually took a page of notes on every interview, so 100 pages of notes on people's perceptions, you know, some personal notes as well as problems that they identified and solutions that they thought we should be pursuing. And I looked at those and said, okay, one observation isn't necessarily something that we need to act on, but if I saw a trend, 2, 3, 5 people were saying this, sometimes 10 people were saying the same thing, I said, oh, okay, this is something I need to pay attention to. I'm now seeing a pattern that is significant, and that people are saying the same things and in different ways maybe, but I tried to classify those trends into logical groups that we could actually take action on.
Okay, and then what did you do with your 100 pages of notes?
Well, I converted that into a report, an action item, you know, report out saying, you know, this is what I heard. I communicated back to the staff. This is what I felt you were sharing with me, and the patterns and the trends, and we put together a list of actions that we were going to take to address what were like the top 10 trends that I heard through the interview process.
And the title of this slide is that you needed a better plan. And how were you left feeling after you'd done the 100 surveys and the 100 interviews rather, and you had put together the report? And I suspect you felt a little bit overwhelmed.
Yeah, I did, and I knew I couldn't continue that process of talking to 100 people on a weekly basis. So I knew I wanted to keep communications open. I wanted employees to know I was there. Was listening and cared about what they were sharing. But obviously, one-on-ones with 100 people is time-consuming, and I wasn't going to be able to sustain this. So I needed a better solution, and that's why I turned to TINYpulse.
With that, I'd like to have Kevin talk to us about some of the best practices that he and TINYpulse have discovered as organizations implement surveys.
Yeah, I'll keep it really simple. The three best practices that we see are: number one, please don't do a survey or ask questions unless you're prepared to take action. So as Robin mentioned earlier, you have to have the engagement of the senior leadership team. This is why Doug has been so successful, because he had that commitment. So don't do this unless you're prepared to listen and look at that feedback and make change. The second one, which I think is really important for this audience, because I know most of you are still doing annual surveys, is please don't wait until it's too late. If you're going to wait a year to get some of these results, chances are you're not going to be able to address some of the issues you have around engagement and retention. And it's a big issue for a lot of the customers that we're talking with right now, especially in the US, where unemployment is at a pretty low level. The third, you've got to share the results. If you're going to ask an employee to take time out to do something, they want to see what other people are saying. And a lot of times that actually helps guide them into how they're thinking about the problem. So definitely share back the results. We know that the companies that do this get the highest participation rates, and that's a pretty critical factor. And the final thing is, when you look at the results, understand the data around it. So when you do stuff, you should be able to benchmark what your results look like against your industry, against everybody else that has done that. Benchmarking is really critical for understanding this. You should be able to look at trends over time to know if you've improved in certain areas. And then finally, I think it's really important to segment and filter the data. We found that in many companies, some of the problems don't exist company-wide, but are in specific divisions. They could be in a location. So if you want to be surgical about fixing the problems, you need to understand where they're at. And so those are the kind of quick rules of best practices that we've seen in working with over 1,000 companies for the past 3 years.
What happened at Guide 1 when you started communicating more often with leadership?
Yeah, we had a significant jump in engagement just in terms of the interaction that I was having with the staff. I'll talk a little bit more about, why we went in the direction of the pulse surveys weekly. I, like the rest of you on the phone, was doing annual or every other year surveys, and Kevin's exactly right. It was not getting the feedback quick enough for me to be able to respond. And I wanted to, the three things I heard in the interview process that were going well was good opportunities with investment in technology. The teamwork was excellent, very connected to one another, and they had a broad span of control due to the size of our organization. But on the downside, they said they weren't feeling heard by management. They were kind of giving up as feedback was going nowhere. And third is the culture was one of being date-driven and quality suffering as a result of that. So I needed a better way to deal with that feedback that had to be more frequent than once a year. I collect this information and then they don't hear back how we're doing on that.
Sorry, Doug, why don't you share more with us about how you chose and implemented TINYpulse and how it helps improve communications?
Yeah, I would fall into that last category as I saw major improvement in engagement. Why I was interested in TINYpulse was the efficiency. Obviously holding one-on-ones with 100 people regularly was impossible. I was glad I did it because I got to meet everybody and got to understand the broader picture, but I wanted a way to be much more action-oriented in my response to all of that. So the weekly surveys with TINYpulse was something that intrigued me. So I made a commitment. I'm going to do this, and started to prepare my team with, really appreciated all the feedback I got, and I'd like to do something, quick and easy. If you would be willing to respond once a week to a survey, I'd like to implement this TINYpulse process. And I actually had an all-hands meeting and asked everybody, to raise their hand if they thought that would be a good thing, and all hands flew up. So people were desperate to be heard, and they really wanted a mechanism to give feedback to me on a regular basis. So I said, now when you do this, I'm also interested in publishing those results back to you in the form of the comments that are being made, in the form of the results, how you're responding to these questions. And I don't want to do that without your permission share that back, because it'll become public information, what you share in comments. So if you put something in the comments that identify you, it would come back, and you could be identified and associated with that comment. So are you guys okay with me also sharing this information back to the group so everybody gets to hear what other people are thinking? And again, all hands shot up. So I think I asked for permission, and I got permission to both implement the survey and share the results. So that was important, for me to do this, and to get a better understanding of those big trends that I saw in the interview process, really being able to drill down on those to understand what kind of the root cause was underneath the covers.
Okay, and so if we go to the next slide, why TINYpulse? What made you pick that solution over some of the others that were out there?
Well, I was also going to answer the key challenges that we were experiencing, or what I learned, from implementing it. But maybe we can answer that next, Robin. The reason I chose it was I had an executive coach that wrote a blog, and in his blog he said, check out TINYpulse for feedback from employees. And I went out to the website, looked at it, and I saw exactly what Kevin said. Don't do this unless you're going to commit. So I had to ask myself the hard question: am I willing to commit my time and my action to respond? Because Kevin is exactly right. If you go into this, don't do it thinking you're just going to ask for feedback and you're going to get it, and that's the end. It is, completing that feedback loop, which is communicating back what you heard and what you're going to do about it. That's the most important step, is how you engage back with your staff after you've heard what they've said. It's good to share it with them. This is what I heard. This is what you said to one another, and make sure everybody hears that. But I had a weekly dialogue with my staff saying, this is what I heard this week, and this is what we intend to do about it. And I couldn't, promise to fix everything, and I didn't. But I did promise to take action on things that I could, and that in some cases, I needed their help in order to implement the changes. I looked at the cost and the features and decided to pilot it with my team, and here we are, almost going on 2 years later, and have found it to be extremely helpful in my organization.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just knew I had to commit, and I did.
Right, and so if you go to the next slide, Kevin, I think this is a great place, Doug, for us to go back to the challenges that that your team was experiencing at that point. Because you mentioned to us that, you mentioned in an all-hands meeting, and then you sent out an introductory email. That's where this quote comes from. But, at what challenges were you seeing at that point?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the 3 trends that were positive and negative, but, what I heard a lot about were simple things like our facilities and in our environment. We had, believe it or not, leaky ceilings in our area where IT was working. We had skylights that were leaking. We had water coming in. We had dust and other allergens that people were complaining about. We had poor lighting and workstation issues, things that I wasn't really aware of until I started getting this feedback regularly. And I worked with our facilities team and started addressing those issues. They had stated in the interviews that communication with managers wasn't good. So I dug down into that and asked, people, well, what can you do to help communicate with your managers, and managers, what can you do to help communicate with your staff more openly, and really got a whole communication movement going between managers and staff. They were saying they weren't feeling empowered or engaged. And again, they'd lost their voice. So this gave them a voice, and in my weekly response, I would suggest ways that we could empower our team and engage the team to get their voice back. And there was a lot of victimization language that I was hearing, even in the TINYpulse comments. That I feel like I've said this 10 times before, and no one hears me. And then my favorite feature that I'll talk a little bit about is the ability to communicate directly with my staff through TINYpulse. They have this very cool feature where that individual is anonymous in their comments. I don't know who it is that I'm talking to via email. They know it's me responding to them, so they know Doug heard me, and Doug's now asking me, tell me more about that problem. Can you tell me what you've tried to resolve this, and what I could do to help, what your manager could do to help? What do we need to do here to solve this problem? And that was a tremendous way for me to engage personally with people that had a specific problem. Maybe they didn't want to talk about it openly, but when I started communicating with them via email, I typically got a very open response on what the depth of that problem was about, and we could solve it real time through email. Very cool feature.
That is a cool feature. When you initially launched the surveys, what was your biggest concern about doing it?
Probably the response rate. Would I get, would people burn out on this, and it'd be one of those things that it's a new thing for Doug. He's going to try it for a month, and then he's going to forget about us, and we're going to go back to the way it always was. And it was the flavor of the month club. So I had to make a long-term commitment, and I had to encourage response. And you saw in my email, I really said, guys, the one thing I'm asking you to do here is participate. If you participate, I will respond, and I will commit to taking action. So we set a 60% target that was our response rate target, and part of TINYpulse allows you to know, what is your percentage response every week. And if it fell below that, I would start to encourage them in my weekly feedback. Here's what I heard. I want to hear more. Please take the time. It takes 1 minute to win it. Track these. The folks that are responding, they get a little emblem that says, hey, you've responded 5 weeks in a row. Congratulations. 6 weeks, 7 weeks. So I said, whoever has the highest weeks in a row, please send me a screenshot, because I can't see this. We don't track you individually, but you do. Get a feedback from TINYpulse saying you've responded how many weeks in a row, and I got one back for 21 weeks in a row, and we were at week 21. And so I had 2 people actually that sent me screenshots saying they'd done it 21 weeks in a row. So I made a big deal about that in my all hands meeting, gave them an award for being the highest participants in the TINYpulse survey, and so tried to encourage them through a lot of carrot and very little stick. I was very careful not to ever judge feedback, and that's the other thing I would share with the audience here is when you get this feedback, some of it's going to hurt. You're going to wince. You're going to go, oh man, I've heard this before. I don't want to deal with this. As a leader, you just don't want to deal with some of this stuff, but you must, and you have to just take it and say thank you. Thank you for the feedback, and here's what I think I can do about it, and here's what I'd like to see you do about it. And again, I could get very personal in the interaction on the email, saying, have you talked to your manager about this? They said, no, I'm afraid of my manager. And it's like, oh, why is that? And without them disclosing who they are, eventually some people would out themselves and tell me, hey, Doug, this is Robin, and I'm struggling with my leader, and can you help me with that? And I said, well, that's something you and your leader really need to work through. But tell me more about it. And so always open, always not judging the feedback, but wanting to understand, seeking to understand what it is the issue is, and then empowering them to solve it for themselves. Because so many times I think people think it's up to managers to solve these, or it's up to the CIO to solve these. And I was very clear with everybody, look, if you're depending on me to solve all the problems we have in IT, good luck. We're going to fail, because I'm not that good. But all of you are, and together we can do this. So it just created a dialogue that was very healthy.
Well, and I love your example of, asking people to say how the screenshots with the participation and the carrots and the recognition. I think that probably helped your response rates. If you'll go to the next slide, Kevin, I thought it would be important for us to share. Every week, TINYpulse sends the question of the week to the organizations it works with, right?
That's correct. And so the way it works is we have a question bank. All of our questions are rooted in a lot of analysis or experience, a lot of statistical and regression analysis to know, what questions can yield the best results. And our customers also have the option of asking their own custom questions. So a lot of the ones that Doug chose in the very beginning are part of our questions. And there's a lot of thought and thinking that goes into our plan around this. And let me give you an example. One of the first questions that we ask is, what's the one thing that we're doing that we should start doing to be more successful? The reason we ask that question is that's our slam dunk question. We want to make it really easy for you to get feedback that you can act on. And we've heard from many organizations that we work with that that's a great kind of first question to go with, because it pointed out some things that they were doing well that they didn't know that were going great, that they could do more of. And so again, like I said from the very beginning, you need to be prepared to take action, and we're trying to make that as easy for you as possible. Second question, on a scale of 1 to 10, how valued do you feel at work? Well, that's an example of the regression analysis that we do. We know that if you score highly on that, you're going to have a really high retention rate. If you're scoring poorly, then you're probably at risk for turnover. The next question, do you feel your manager has clearly defined your roles and responsibilities? We want to give a 360-degree view of the things that are important to somebody's engagements. It's their manager, it's their culture. We ask a lot of questions about the people you work with, because we're seeing that becoming very important. So we're really trying to give a 360-degree view of what's happening in the company. And also on the next question, that's a great example of turnover. Like, is somebody going to be here in a year? And then we can look at that question and run a lot of correlations against that. And then a lot about what we do is we want to start a great conversation. And I think it's important to hear some of the feedback maybe that you don't want to hear, but also to focus on the positive and the constructive as well. So by asking the question, what do you love about your job? We've given companies a lot of insights into what their employees like, and some of them have actually changed some of the recruiting strategies and messaging to focus on what employees really like about their company. The other thing that we do, and I'll let Doug talk about that, is we will repeat questions so you can see the trend analysis, which is one of the biggest benefits of the Pulse survey. By asking the same question once a month, you get a sense of how you're trending over time. So Doug, I'll turn that over to you to share how you...
Right, so let's go to the next slide, Kevin. But what I did want to say is that you also benchmark, right? So organizations who are answering the weekly survey questions, you can benchmark them against other organizations, correct?
That's correct. So we can benchmark it against everybody that answered that question, and we can also do industry benchmark. So if you're in financial services, you can see how you compare to that sector, or if you're in healthcare, you can see how you compare to that.
Terrific. And then this question, how happy are you? This is the question that you ask every month, right?
Correct.
Yeah, what's beautiful about, I track this over time, as you can see, and on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I hate my job or I'm unhappy at work, and a 10 being I'm ecstatic. Obviously, I'm pushing for 8s, 9s, and 10s, and I got a lot of those, but on average, you can see, we peaked out at like a 7-1, and I could see over time kind of what was happening in my organization, what was causing satisfaction, what was causing dissatisfaction. You see that big slope down after the 7-1. I know exactly what was causing that at the time. We were going through a really difficult transition. So it just confirmed, validated for me the feelings that people were having. And it also, again, this ability to react individually to folks. If I got a 1, 2, or 3 on the happiness scale, I could say, I'm so sorry to hear that you're a 1. Can I do something to help? Because this is someone that is obviously very discouraged. And Kevin said that killer question, which I also paid close attention to, is how likely are you to be here a year from today? If the answer is not likely, I'm out of here. I would respond to those people as well and say, could you please share with me what's going on, and is there anything I can do to help? And they would open a dialogue with me saying, this is why I'm so unhappy, or this is why I'm thinking about leaving. And typically they wouldn't out themselves on that conversation, but they would tell me what was going on, and I tried to encourage them. Here are things that you can do, and here's some things that I think would help us get you up in the scale of happiness and up in the scale of retention, because obviously we're all concerned about retaining our best and brightest. I didn't know if this was one of my best or brightest, or someone that's just unhappy and is always going to be unhappy. And if they stay in the 1 to 3 category, I probably would want them to leave, because they're poisoning the rest of the organization. If they're that unhappy, they need to either find a way to be successful in our organization or leave. So sometimes I would get to that, if they were really frustrated and saying things that I thought were inappropriate, I'd say, at some point you've got to decide whether this is the right place for you, because you're very unhappy, and I want to try to help you with that, but what do you think? And get the dialogue again to move toward a more positive light.
Well, and Doug, and just to reiterate, you didn't know who you were talking to.
I had no idea.
Until they actually said in their response to you back through the TINYpulse platform, hi, this is Janet or Mike or something like
Right,
that.
unless
Right?
they outed themselves, I had no idea who I was interacting with. And TINYpulse has all of that on their back-end server. I couldn't get to know it if I wanted to.
I just wanted to make sure when we talk about outing someone, it was all voluntary.
Yeah, it was always they outed themselves. They said,
right.
Robin, here's why I'm so unhappy, and yes, you can help me. Give me $10,000 and I'll be happier.
Right.
Whatever that decision was.
So let's go to the next slide. And you know, how's it going with sending out the question every week? How much time does it take you to do the weekly survey?
Yeah, so it's less than 5 minutes of my time and less than a minute of theirs. So again, I use the minute to win it. Please give me a rating, and if you add, I encourage comments. That takes a little longer, but less than 5 minutes with the rating and the comments. And my time commitment is about an hour a week. I respond to the individuals, I respond to the group, and I take actions. Those are the three main time commitments I have to make. It takes about an hour a week for me to do that. It's the best hour I'll ever spend every week.
I wish we had that as a quote on the slide. It's the best hour you spend every week. Well, and let's go to the next slide. I want to get through to the slides so we have some time for questions. We've talked about this a lot, the moving from anonymity back to individual questions, conversations, and actions. Is there anything else that we haven't covered around, you know, anonymity?
The kinds of, yeah, I did talk a lot, so we don't need to spend much time, but tell me, you know, my questions were, tell me more, have you talked to your manager about this, what can you do to solve this? So trying to empower them to take action themselves, because I typically can't solve the problem, especially if it's anonymous, right? I don't know how to solve this problem because I don't know enough about the individual circumstance to help them. So if they told me enough, and often that would get them to say, this is who, you know, this is Robin, and here's the help I could use from you, Doug. But I didn't ask them to do that. I didn't ask them to come out of anonymity, but to solve the problem themselves, if at all possible. How can you solve this? So it's important that you encourage with the right questions for them to solve their own problem.
Okay, thank you. So the next slide is telling us we're going to share with you guys sort of the ahas, sort of what happened. And so we'll go to the next slide, which is we'll have Doug sort of walk us through what actually changed as a result of using TINYpulse.
Yeah, so you see the things on the slide. In addition, I would say, you know, the physical facility issues, we took a lot of action there. We solved this 30-year-old leak that I was told by our facilities folks, we just can't figure out the problem. And I said, well, we're going to keep trying, and we did, and we fixed it. So after 30 years, we finally have a dry work environment, I'm happy to say, and that made my staff very happy. We also, got to the bottom of why people were feeling it was a date-driven culture, and how could we impact quality, and got our teams to a more agile environment where BAs and developers and quality assurance folks were all working together on quality. Finally, probably engagement teams were formed because, again, I wanted to empower them to come up with the solutions. So they formed teams, and I gave them, things that came out of TINYpulse to work on. And they came back with recommendations, the top 3 areas to improve and put action plans in place to solve the problems.
And just the decreased turnover, those are significant results. That in 2014, the turnover on the IT team was 12.1%. In 2015, it was 3.1%. That's really significant.
It is, and I can't attribute all of that to doing this, but it absolutely helped. It absolutely gave me the ability to understand when someone was going to leave me, to give them a platform to talk about what was frustrating them at work. And so I do give credit to this process for reducing turnover. Our true correlation here, but all of us face retention is a huge issue, especially in my area of IT, where I've got a lot of competition seeking to take my best and brightest. So this is a big deal for us, and I was happy to see our retention improve significantly.
Yes, that's impressive. So I think the next slide has you going over a few of the lessons learned. I think you've talked about a few of them, but is there any else here that you want to cover?
Yeah, just some people were concerned that folks were hiding behind the anonymity. I would just caution you if people are going way negative on you, to just encourage them, and Kevin talked about this, more positive questions and more positive responses, because people are just going to use anonymity to go negative. That's not helpful. you know, responding every week no matter what. I think that's really important. As Kevin said, you got to act. Look for ways to add value, to respond directly. You know, just encourage your leaders to be approachable and to take action. And bottom line, Kevin said it, I'll say it again to close. Don't do this if you aren't committed to change based on the feedback. That is the commitment you're going to have to make as a leader. If you're going to do this, it's really a commitment that you're going to do something about it. You're not just going to do another survey. You're actually going to do something about what you're hearing.
All right, and on the next slide, just some of the next steps that you're taking in around engagement at Guide 1.
So beyond my group, it expanded to our customer care team. That's our call center, as well as our enterprise project management office. We implemented annual company-wide engagement surveys. You know, that was a 2-year. We're now on an annual cycle, and we're looking at you know, different types of surveys like Net Promoter Score, and we are looking at expanding TINYpulse across Guide 1.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing those. And now we have a few minutes left for some questions.
Yes.
If you have a question and you haven't submitted it, feel free to do that. And Kevin, why don't you ask us the questions?
Great. We've actually got a ton of questions, so any of them, I'm going to go through all of them, and for whatever reason, if we don't answer, we will contact people individually and answer. So one of the first questions is, this sounds like a great tool. How have larger companies used this? 100 people seems manageable, but what if you have 4,000 to 5,000 employees? I'll answer that. That's a great question. We have customers with 160,000 employees. And in there, the way we help manage that process is by creating segments that different leaders and divisions can help run and manage. So you're distributing a lot of the work around this. Usually somebody in HR has oversight and a view of everything that's going on, and then delegates some of the work to the different divisions to handle that. So we can handle much larger questions. Another question was, what is, Doug, maybe you can share this, what was the participation rate over time of the weekly pulses? How long did you anticipate implementing the weekly pulse?
So it was about 60% was our goal, and we typically hit that. Again, when we fell below, I amped up my encouragement. But it was 60 or above. 60 to 70 was typical. Some people just don't like to respond to these things. And our, you know, we targeted a year in IT, and then we're doing a year in EPMO and call center.
Great. And then another question is, who provides the benchmark data? TINYpulse provides that. Here is another question. Could you discuss the Net Promoter Score and why you use that?
Well, it is for customers. So we do regular surveys of our customers to see how many promoters and detractors we have, and are constantly taking action to push you know, more from the detractor and through the neutral stage and into the promoter. There's a science behind this that, and it's the killer question. You know, how likely are you to recommend, you know, in our case, Guide 1 to another family or friend, colleague, and that is an important question for us to know how people are responding to and how many folks are out there cheering for our organization.
Great. Here's another question. Did you start the surveys in 2015? If so, how did you determine that employee engagement improved from 2014 to 2015, since none was done in 2014?
Well, we had engagement surveys every other year, and so I was able, you know, again, the correlation is tough to say. Employee engagement improved just because of TINYpulse and even retention, so I won't make that claim that it's a direct correlation, but we did see improvement in engagement just through anecdotal evidence of it. People said they loved it. People said, you know, I see us taking actions that we never took in the past. People were saying, you know, I'm happier. They're more willing to speak up, more empowered. Those are just things you hear, you know, water cooler talk and one-on-one discussions with your staff. So the overall feeling was one of a much more communicative and empowered organization. And when we do engagement surveys, so I'm anxious to get my next one to see has it gone up again.
Great. Here's a question I'll answer. Did you see a correlation between customer Net Promoter Score and employee Net Promoter Score? We actually did some analysis on happiness score, and we were able to see a really strong correlation between employee happiness and customer happiness. So that's an example of how the happiness question can be used to answer some of these questions. And there were several questions related to how the data could be cut and refined, and they wanted to know if it's all done at the aggregate level. So I'll answer that question. You can use TINYpulse, and you can take cuts to the data by group, by function, by tenure. It's really how you set this up. And then the question is, well, how's it anonymous? So one of the things that we do is we make sure that there are 5 or more responses in any cut of the data, so you can never isolate who said what. So that's how we protect the anonymity. And I think, oh, here's another one. Can the benchmark data be segmented to like-size orgs? Yes, that's one of the things that we can do as part of our custom analysis packages. Very interesting to see that you study short-term trends. Has it ever happened that you see a spike, but you're not quite sure what happened? What do you do then?
Yeah, I did. I've seen, spikes and drops that I wasn't able to understand exactly what was going on. So yeah, I mean, then you just talk to people and ask what's happening here. TINYpulse isn't the only way that you get your information about what's happening in the organization. I'm a big fan of, wandering around.
Robin, I'd like to thank you for all the time and research and vetting you did to look at these results. Doug, thanks for all your time. And if everybody wants a quick tip on how to be successful, you've got to find a leader like Doug to help champion your cause and be a part of your HR program success.